Light.
I have on my list. So, email Francis, email Francis. Never got there.
We want to welcome the wonderful Brother Donald Bisson, originally from Maine, but now living in the Bronx. Don is an incredible spiritual director for many of us who benefited from him that way, but really a skilled interpreter of Jungian topology to spirituality. Not just skilled, but probably the best. I've never, ever experienced anyone more adept at that. Don has studied, in Zurich, and he has degrees from the Pacific School of Religion out in California and other degrees galore, and has read every book that's ever been written. And recently was a presenter for the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, and speaking not just in the United States but all over, and has become a darling of a good friend of mine in the Trappist Monastery in Memkin in South Carolina, where Don gives programs and all kinds of programs. So we have welcome to all our people on Facebook, and we're happy that you've joined us, and we'll say invite the Holy Spirit to bless our gathering. And we do know, Holy Spirit, you are with us, hovering in a special way over Don. We thank you for the gift he has been to us in so many ways, the many peoples he's touched through his artistry and gift of spiritual direction. We thank you now especially for his amazing program in the Bronx in New York, for training so many peoples there to continue that gift of spiritual direction for so many peoples in the inner city. We thank you for all of us here this Sabbath day. Each of us has made it holy with our presence, as we're present to your presence. We lift up the many intentions of our hearts you alone know best, as we unite ourselves with all those who are so overwhelmed and overburdened and experience little hope. For you are the one who gives us that gift. And so today we will highlight it as we highlight your gift of hope and love, your gift of compassion and peace. We make our prayer together in the holy name of our God.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here in this beautiful fall weather and having opportunities to see Washington. Francis and I go way back. You get to a point in life, decades are like nothing. So it's like 30 years ago, we encountered each other in New York after I had been in California and worked at Mount St. Alphonsus. But we have become colleagues and friends, but I would also say most especially co-creators of a future that we will not see. Being on the margins for a long time means you may not see what you have spent your life's journey about. I think of our property in Esopus, where in 1910 they planted these trees, and then, we sit under these giant trees now, and the people who planted them, we have no idea who did, and it's not even significant. So I feel like my life has been an anticipation of a future that I will not see. And making friends with that is very important. I think that's where our hope comes from. Our hope is not to be attached that the success or failure of our work is going to be seen in our lifetime. We have to see it as a contribution to a much larger entity. When Francis asked me to come for this particular day, I thought 2 weeks before the end of the election, we don't talk about the day of the election, we talk about the end of the election, that this is a Kairos moment, and this collective darkness and stuff is pivotal in our personal and collective experiences. It's probably the most significant election since the Civil War, or even from our foundation of our country. So this is massive. Jan and I yesterday went to the African American Museum in Washington. And both of our takeaways was, more things change, the more they remain the same. And that so many of the history from the very beginning to the most recent is a repetition of a pattern of complexes, both of shadow material and collective shadow, and the reality of evil. And I think we are living in that same conduit of chemistry between personal shadow and collective American shadow, and the impact of evil in our midst. So many things happen daily, it's hard to keep up with all the both possibilities and lies and manipulations. I'm hoping that this day will be a way for us to articulate maybe more clearly what is happening and what I can do to participate in this chemistry. Hope, by the way, is not optimism. One can be pessimistic about an election and still be hopeful, because hope is not determined about ego success. If it was based upon ego success, then it wouldn't really be hope. Hope has to be something unexpected, something spontaneous, something given, something that is beyond us. The ego is attached, and the deeper self is not attached. It's relevant to the evolution of what is really happening. Hope is found in a deep connection to our evolutionary future, held in the mystery of the divine and human participation. We hope, we yearn. The building of the reign of God is a hope built in the present and yet unfulfilled. If we think that hope is something that will fulfill us in this moment, it's not hope, it's something else. However, hope is not a feeling, it's an action. You know, we think about hope being hopeful, okay, like an emotion. I think hope is an action-orientated participation. I choose to move in a direction of hope. I choose to participate with others in a direction of hope. It's not about a feeling. Because, you know, if you look at our history, the darkest moments of our history were never filled with hope, but there were people who, through their action, orientated their life towards hope, whether it's in the church or whether it's in society. The view, as Francis said, that I come to is, you know, in my interest of and study of Jungian insights that might help our spirituality, but it comes mostly from years of experience in doing spiritual direction and retreats. My insights come primarily from observations of what I call short-term movements, like retreats, or long-term movements, like years of spiritual direction, in which men, women of all sexual orientations and many geographies and international travel in Asia, Africa, throughout Europe, from living for 25 years in multicultural environment and inner city in Oakland, New York, Chicago, I've seen the human soul and heard the stories of human stories, whether it be Latino or new immigrants or Asian or African Americans. My life has been very rich in listening to stories. And if you really listen deeply to a story, you have to be moved. You cannot remain the same if you listen to the depth of a story. So my observations are not primarily through the lenses of academic insight, even though I might use some of that language to be able to articulate it. It's more from my commitment to listening deeply to stories so that they may be touched by the divine interaction between myself, the person. Jung said that, the person who listens deeply must be changed equally to the degree that the person who is sharing. So I have been in that container over and over and over again, be willing to be changed in my attitudes, in my views, in my judgments, in my past. And I'm going to start with some quotes and insights from Jung on this issue of what must we do to move towards hope. And the first thing he said is that we have to be more committed to our growth at becoming human than technological advancement. He said back in the 1950s that our technology has radically outpaced our consciousness. And I think this has spiraled to the nth degree at this point, that our technology is incredible. Now, being of a certain age, I get surprised by technology all the time. I use Uber, and it's like, how do they know where I am? How does he know my name before I get in the car? Why is it that this all happens and I don't use any money? It's just, everything's amazing for an old person, I mean, young people do this stuff automatically, and it's like, well, that's the way it should be. But for those of us who remember waiting for a cab in the rain and like you can't find a payphone and blah, 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 you realize this is magical, okay? But what Jung said is that our exaggerated rationalization of our consciousness, our ego control, our necessity to control our environment, our nature itself, has limited our sense of self only to the present. What is good for me now? It has no sense of where we came from or where we're going. The more ego-driven we are, the more we are limited to seeing our implications for ourselves and others. He says, when we live on that level of only ego consciousness, we become creatures without meaning. The feeling in life is not about enjoyment of life. It's about possessions and materialism, control and power. He says life becomes stale and is no longer the exponent of the complete person. People live as though they were walking in shoes too small. The quality of eternity, which is so characteristic of the life of the so-called primitive, is entirely lacking. There's no sense of mystery. There's no sense of connectedness. It's all driven by the ego and its desires, which means manipulating others, doing all the things necessary in order to have what they want. My favorite quote from Jung in the 1930s was, "There is a deep need in the world today for a new form of spiritual direction." And he actually saw his own study of analytical psychology as a means of dealing with the spiritual crises of the modern person. A lack of connection to interiority, a lack of sense of mystery, and the lack of connection to the eternal. This comes from a letter that he wrote in 1932. Now remember what Europe was like in 1932 with the rise of fascism and all the things that was happening. He says, "In the midst of this darkness, I feel our only hope is small communities of contemplative consciousness. These will serve as lights on the mountaintops to provide hope for the future of all of mankind." small communities of contemplative consciousness. Awareness of what it means to be human and to be in relationship to something greater than ourselves. This as the world was collapsing upon itself in the 1930s. Could we not say the same thing today? As our world is beset with so much darkness and fear and anxiety, that where is our hope? I believe our hope goes back to Rana in the 1960s in the Vatican II when he said the future of Christianity, if it's going to be, is going to have to be that of the mystic. I think 60 years later, we are beginning to live with the implications of this. Because it's not good enough to be good. And I'm going to spend a lot of time later of the morning, is that there's a great danger that good people are doing horrible things. And that this militaristic Christianity are good people being manipulated and allowing themselves to be manipulated by power and darkness. Because they refuse to see the deeper goodness, not the superficial. Our lawns are clean, we're charitable, we help people. All of that stuff is not good enough to fend off evil. If anything, those very behaviors can be seduced by evil because it's too superficial. And it just reminds me of the gospel itself, that those who were superficially good were not able to listen to what Jesus was trying to say. They did all the rules, and they followed the life, but it was only those who were on the margins that understood authentic goodness that comes from compassion and forgiveness and community. Jung said back in the 1930s, he said, my biggest problem with Christians is that they can find God every place except in the human soul. And this is I think, the revolutionary moment in our global consciousness, that God is not primarily out there. We live with a consciousness of Bette Midler, from a distance. There is no distance. And we continue to think that God is out there, separate from God's creation, separate from my own soul, separate from... So the revolution that I think the Jungian Christian dialogue is about is that God is present in the voice that still lives and dwells within the human soul. There is the voice of God, capital V, conscience. That we realize that the unconscious does not only hold our potential darkness, but it also holds our potential light in our relationship to God. If we only live with a relationship to the exterior senses, then we have no connection with God. Because the only true connection with God is the fact that God already dwells within us and propels us to awaken to that reality. The other thing that we keep missing is that our woundedness is not something to be ashamed of, but our woundedness seems to be the very place where the womb of God lives. Whether it was Eckhart or others in history knew this insight, that the wound becomes the womb of transformation. And that as much as you want to destroy God or God imagery is formulated and created continually within the human soul. And we have to discern the fact that our interiority is always producing God images for us to connect with. They may not be universal, but they're particular, and they can be very significant in discernment. We also have to realize that if we are in touch with the inner world, we are also have to be in touch with there are forces within us that are also malevolent, that evil does also exist. And there are destructive forces and voices that would like to lead us towards despair rather than towards hope. And there's a battle going on all the time. And the battle is about discerning. The voices are there. What do I listen to? What do I reject? Who am I in relation to this voice? And the realization that the voices within us, some of those voices need to be made friends with and integrated, that we'll talk about. And some of those voices need to be expunged. Let it go. Asking the grace of God to take that voice away. Some of the voices are meant to be more inclusive of who I am, and at the same time, others need to be rejected. I was reading recently something that they used the term paradoxical consciousness, which means the rational cannot make sense of God. As much as you read about God, rational interpretation of God is very limited. This is when we talk about unless we become mystics. Nothing against rational reflection on God. We have philosophy, we have theology, we have all of those elements within us. But it's insufficient because life is extraordinarily paradoxical. If you live life of any degree, you're going to hit a wall that this makes no sense. But it's what I've been preparing for my whole life because it does make sense. And that's paradoxical consciousness. You have to live a certain amount of time to find this paradoxical place. But it's a place where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I mean, I love the fact that, in our reading of Scripture, we read paradoxes all the time and never stop to think about what it means to experience paradox. Or, even more arrogant, someone tries to explain a paradox, which is not explainable. You sit before a paradox, because paradoxes rip you apart. It makes no sense, except between you and God. It makes sense. You can't explain it to somebody. I believe we are in a critical moment of our history because this God problem, this God issue, this external God that we are still dealing with, feeds nationalism, unbridled patriotism, fascism, fundamentalism, terrorism, traditionalism. It feeds all the isms. This immaturity of wanting answers and security in the face of mystery produces all those isms. I'm going to suggest this morning that the real problem beneath all of these isms right now, remember, it was in the 19th century that Nietzsche said that God was dead. In this 21st century, I think we can say that God is not dead, but God is severely wounded. And there is the necessity to heal the image of God. Now, because of the intense work that I do in spiritual direction, which also includes working with the unconscious and dreams and so forth, I have discovered over these many years the intense need to heal our God image. And if we don't do that, it completely pollutes everything we do and touch. I think societally and collectively, right now, I think the old God structure and images are collapsing. Okay? Now, However, there's two responses that are terrifying in this moment of great awakening. The first is fundamentalism and the restoration of the unquestionable orthodoxy in God imagery from the past, and reinforcing those images through irrational fear and attempt to keep any newness out of the equation. This is fundamentalism and traditionalism. There's a battle to reinstate the old as if it was complete. It rejects the evolution of our understanding of God, or even the possibility that God is revealing God's self differently in this moment than it did. The idealization of the past. And I think what it is also to reinforce that the past was holy and is no longer holy now. It drives me mad when you have to say Holy Mass all the time. Please stand for Holy Mass. It's not like please stand for the liturgy, please stand for... Everything has to be reinforced, because you know what it is? The numinous has come out of the bottle and they're trying to put the holy back in the bottle. And we know how to make the holy. This is the obsession with adoration rather than Eucharistic celebration. Let's gaze and have all of this, incense and everything, because let's create an atmosphere of holy. I have friends who went to a Latin Mass and they said, oh, it felt so holy. What? The man's back is towards you and he's mumbling something on top of the altar. I remember that as a kid. It's like, this was really, it felt so holy. What are you talking about? Because fundamentalism and traditionalism is a rejection of the evolution of our God image, which is happening. I think there's a radical evolution of our God imagery. That's why they hate Pope Francis so much and hate anything that has to do with possibilities of things not being what they were before. And of course, this addiction, I call it an addiction, is particularly vulnerable with the young, because they have no stability in their environment at all. Okay? So we have young people coming to our house and they, we're a bunch of old men and they think that we're sacrilegious, because of, the behavior in the chapel, whatever it might be. It's like, it's bizarre. It's bizarre, totally bizarre. But I think it is an attempt, deep attempt to collectively remain unconscious. Make America great again, make the church great again. It's the same thing. The political is that's when we were really Americans. The religious is that's when we were really Catholic. And in their sincerity, they want to be truly Catholic, and they define that as truly Catholic, because no one has educated them as to what Catholic means. Okay? On the other hand, we've got this orientation towards this fundamentalism. On the other extreme, we have this smorgasbord of spiritual and religious activities that is a multi-billion-dollar business, with every guru on the sun making all kinds of money, and New Age places popping up. A lot of old religious houses bought over by New Age places, and a spirituality of the individual. It's the spirituality of the individual. There's no community, there's no particular morality, nor is there a particular orientation towards changing the world. It's all about taking care of myself. And it's, all you have to do is offer something as holistic, and it's $10 more. It's a commercialism of spirituality. Now, I think, however, to give everybody a due here, it's all an attempt to find a deeper meaning. I think the traditionalist is an attempt to find a deeper meaning. There's no meaning. They're finding, you know. On the other hand, with this spiritual smorgasbord, what I have noticed with many of my directees is that they've had to go east in order to find their bearings. So, I don't know how many Jewish directees I have had that were secular Jews that became Buddhist, that went into psychology and holistic health, that found a spiritual director, okay, and then is trying to make their way back to Judaism, not where they started from. I can't tell you how many Christians I have had that, you know, does Buddhist practice, Hindu chants, you know, and the funny thing is, I've had a Jewish man, secular, blah, 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 Buddhist, you know, in West, what's the place? Woodstock. Oh. You have all these Boo Jews. The places, and they're all therapists. So, but it's the search for healing and meaning. That's what it is. And the thing is like, I've had secular Jews become Buddhists who have come to me for spiritual direction and reintroduce them into the depth of their spirituality and have returned to Judaism, and one is a rabbi. Okay, so it's like, that's the path. Why is it? Because Buddhism has become the emergency room for God imagery. You go to Buddhism to get rid of all God imagery. And what you try and do is to detox from the images that are deeply ingrained in their psyche, particularly post-Holocaust Jews, post-Vatican II Catholics. You know, it's a lot of this stuff. And of course, a lot of our Catholicism was based on culture, more than religion, practices that were, you know, magical thinking, more than good theology, you know. So there's a lot to clean out. I have 3 Southern people, evangelicals, for spiritual direction, and I have been dealing for years to detox the Jesus wound. They cannot bear hearing the word Jesus without feeling traumatized. Can't even use the word God in order to deal with spiritual direction. So wounded from their experience. Okay? I mean, all this stuff that's happening in the society is so, it's like Jews dealing with the Holocaust. It's just overwhelming them. So I think what I'm trying to say is our real fundamental intrapsychic issue in all of the things that's happening around us is about God. It's about our images of God and who we are in relationship to God. Because if you can go to the extreme of either case, we're wrestling with this. And a lot of powerful, politicized economics billionaires are using this for their own empowerment. It's being used. This is where evil comes in now. Because then you use people's vulnerability and hunger for meaning in a manipulative way in order to regain power. Now, there is no going back. The genie is out of the bottle. The numinous cannot be put back into the bottle of this makes us holy. You know, it can't work. We have to find new ways of experiencing numinosity, a new way of feeling connected to the divine, a new way to have religious experience. And I have seen that over and over again. This is happening. I have many directees who are in the healing process from their own Christian roots, having repeated dreams of Christmas. because there has to be a complete rebirth of who Christ is. The old Christ, the old images are gone. I'll give you an example of one man who had repeated images of Christmas, and he had this one particular numinous dream in which there's an angelic force, very much like the painter who did the Annunciation with a light, like this light force by the Christmas tree that and spoke, had a relationship to him, and this angelic force said there are two gifts underneath the tree. You can only have one. You have to choose one. And underneath the tree were two little train sets, like you have, like kids have at Christmas time. And they looked exactly the same. So he didn't know what to choose. But the angel said, let me educate you as the difference between the two. This train set is run on batteries. Now, it's important for you to know that this man is in recovery. So this train set is connected to the wall socket, and it's connected to a higher power. Now, choose ego or the higher power. But it's using Christmas, the rebirth of his understanding of who this Christ event is that he's connected to something bigger than himself, symbolically represented through Christ. So all of the things that are going on today, I think this is the understructure. Now, this was the introduction, so we can go to the material now. If you look at the dimensions of the shadow, okay, because I think this is how it all works now. It works in the fact that we are always dealing with the shadow. We can't get rid of the shadow. All we can do is, how do I respond to it? It is like evil. You cannot get rid of evil. As soon as you try and destroy evil, you become evil. So there's no way of destroying evil. What you can do is disempower connection to evil, and you can also surrender what you cannot do to God in relationship to evil. But you cannot get rid of evil yourself or collectively. As soon as there's a huge thing about getting rid of everything that is evil, you have the Taliban. And when you have that, who suffers the most? Women. Because women are identified as the evil bringer of evil into to reality. So wherever there's this evil thing, women are going to be suffering the most. And the shadow, or the personal shadow, is defined here as everything about myself in which I am uncomfortable with and not conscious of. And I may not want to be conscious of. It's not just that I'm not conscious and may not want to be conscious of. It is whatever I do not wish to be, but potentially with whom I am. It refers to that portion of us that is constantly shifting and changing in the light of our ego consciousness. Notice, whatever I say yes to, the no creates a shadow. Like I'm going to be always peaceful and calm. Okay, well, you're going to get really angry and resentful. Wherever there's an imbalance, wherever my persona is much greater than anything I am possible to do, it goes into the shadow. And the shadow is not evil in itself, it's just not authentically me. If you've ever known somebody who is like absolute sweetness and light, Jung used to say that there was this one minister who was like absolutely, so wonderful and giving, whatever. He couldn't find where his shadow was, which I'm sure he was trying to prod in there what it was. But he said, the whole family was neurotic. his wife and children were completely carrying all of his neuroses. It had to be dumped somewhere. If you don't deal with it, it's dumped somewhere. Okay? So the personal shadow is that I repress parts of me that I don't find acceptable, either through culture, history, parents, education, anything that I have not felt that is I needed in me to be accepted. Okay? This idealized self creates a demonic self. The collective shadow is when my individual shadow now begins to bond with and unite with. Jung said there's no greater bliss, okay, than finding an enemy. Because then you can lay all of your shit onto somebody else. I don't have to carry this. What a delight it is to have an enemy. Because then I'm not responsible for my own behavior or my own feelings. And let's face it, our culture, which has so many addictive patterns about individualized self, there's all of these cultural issues that says this is what it means to be one of us. Okay? Those accepted, integrated cultural self becomes a worldview in which I believe it is true because my neighbor sees it and they see it and we're all together and like, of course that's the way it is. Of course we're the greatest country in the world. Of course we're the most generous country in the world. Oh my God. You know, we have all of these wonderful gifts and everything. This idealized self is recreated over and over again by a cultural obsession. I could not believe in the museum yesterday all the things that have been culturally reinforced over hundreds of years that we're still dealing every day here. You know, the people who really work and the people who don't work. The people who are not people versus the people that are people. People who are like us, people who are strangers. It's the whole cultural basis, you know, can be seen repeated and repeated. Now, the real danger here is the archetypal shadow. The archetypal shadow is a pattern of primordial living organism, a dynamic organism that has been formed within the psyche about survival. You know, this is our primitive brain that regulates our ability to survive above all things. And when we feel threatened, this dark primordial thing, I had an experience at Mepkin that I had a little education with this. They have this beautiful pond, okay, the retreat house is built on the pond. I'm from Maine. This is foreign territory. There are snakes, there's moss hanging all over. I had, you know, I was in Oz, you know, it was an entirely different place. It was hot as hell, okay? I'm sitting outside as a big northerner, you know, looking at this thing, and all of a sudden jumps out this huge crocodile right outside of this pond, and he's looking at me eye to eye. Now, this is by far one of the most primitive animals that still exists on the planet. Okay, this goes back to prehistoric times, right? When we met eye contact, I was lunch. I did not exist. I did not exist, all right? I'm just lunch. This can happen to human beings if we surrender to this archetypal. We live on this primitive thing that no matter, how could real people allow millions of people to be killed in Dachau and all these things? They have to have this inability to feel. There was no feeling there. There's a coldness, there's an objectivity. You don't exist. You don't exist. That's archetypal evil. Archetypal evil is a living organism in which includes the personal and the collective, but it's a wake-up call that anything can happen. You know, the things that we saw in the museum, you know, about how people were treated and sold and babies sold and separated, all this kind of stuff, okay? And then go to church on Sunday. I mean, there's a famous place where in Poland that there was a place in which the trains had to shift gears, you know, to go to one of the, and there were times in which near there was a church, and people would be screaming for help or water or something, and people sang louder, not to hear. That's archetypal evil, when I collectively don't want to hear. They're not people. Now, we're hearing this every day about immigrants. They are not people. It's the same language. Vermin, diseased, they're not people. Those Haitian people in Springfield, Ohio, doing their work, doing their thing, going to school, not people. They eat our pets. They're not people. That's the lesson of archetypal evil. They're not people. Therefore, we can do anything. We can put them in camps. We can send them back to a destructive place because it's all about us. And therefore, it starts with the personal shadow. Jung said that the greatest social justice work we can do is to work on our own personal shadow. If we can withdraw that energy from the collective energy, we are doing social work. But what we see is that that is an enormous challenge when half the country has bought into this collective shadow piece. Now, how do we become conscious? Okay, this is a really important question in our 21st century, because our continued existence on the planet will depend on it. Because if we're unrelated to nature, it's like, how many hurricanes do you need? How many, it's just, and it's screaming out. The whole world knows this. And still, the power of greed overwhelms the system. Still that way. Now, there are two ways of becoming more conscious. One is the involuntary way. That is, you have made a mess of your life and one day it's going to blow up. And you get a 2x4 in your head. You've just been oblivious to all the messages. You haven't paid any attention to yourself. You don't deal with yourself. You don't look at yourself. You don't analyze yourself. You don't pay attention to your dreams. You kind of like the Walking Dead. You just make decisions based upon your own egocentricity. One of the days you're going to get a 2x4. And that can be a heart attack, or your wife walking out, or your job is diminished. Something can wake you up. Okay? And to a certain extent, without an involuntary wake-up call, it's very difficult to become conscious. And we'll talk about the voluntary way. The voluntary way is through spiritual practice, meditation, self-awareness, making the unconscious more conscious in your daily life, okay? Living with people who are honest and loving towards you and gives you the data that you need. That's very important. Because if you don't live with people who give you data, then how are you going to know what's really happening or not? But in the voluntary way, we are asking our ego to choose to reorientate our life so that we're not addicted to the cultural identity nor addicted to the religious identity that takes away our individuality. In other words, you've got to be your own self. You know, I love St. Thomas More's comment about when he was going off to the gallows. His wife said, everybody else is signing this goddamn thing. Why can't you sign it? And his answer was, I cannot pin my soul on any man's back. Okay? So to do this voluntarily means you've got to have the strength to be able, I don't care if people like me or don't like me, I don't care. I'm willing to, this is the narrow gate. Okay? This is the narrow gate. And what we have lost in our understanding of the narrow gate has been translated in moral behavior, not consciousness. It's a misguided interpretation. Oh, it's the normal, that you got to do everything perfect. No. Perfection is not what's going to get you through the narrow gate. It's going to be a greater interpretation of who you are in truth. It's the truth is the narrow gate. Now, there are 4 ways in which we individually and collectively deal with the shadow. Okay? 4 ways. The most common is it just remains unconscious. I deny, period, that I have a shadow. You know? When it remains unconscious, however, it makes choices for us. So let's say, I have this interior fear of being in crowds or whatever. And somebody says, would you like to come tonight for whatever? And they say, oh no, I can't do that. The unconscious has made the decision for the person, and the person feels that they made the decision. But they really didn't make the decision. Their unfreedom made the decision. Okay? So most of us live with denial and thinking that I am in charge when the unconscious is in charge, when the shadow is making my decision, not me. The second is, of course, we repudiate it and we project it onto everybody else. There is not a word, a phrase, or a statement that Trump has said which is not a projection. It is completely a projection. Every word, every phrase, every statement is a projection about greed, stupidity, blah, 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 blah. So he entirely keeps himself free from any personal responsibility of his behavior because everybody else holds it. That's not me. Okay? So the projection is what I cannot bear to see in myself, I see so clearly in someone else. Now, when the personal here, now what amazes me is intelligent, good people know this is a lie and will buy into a lie and project it consciously even though they know it's a lie. This is cooperation with darkness. This is not a neutral thing. This is an unconscious alignment with a person's darkest shadow projected onto others. It is a moral issue. It cannot be dismissed as like, well, they don't know better. No, because it is the rejection of the truth. All the quotes that are on the wall of yesterday's museum was all about truth. And yet, people know it's a lie and know that it's dangerous, but will allow it because of the cultic nature of this identity. Thirdly, we identify it and live it out. Unable to critique consequences for ourselves. So this is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You know? We identify it and live it out. I live out my shadow. So I think Trump has completely denied his light and is living out completely of his shadow. He's not split because there's no tension between them. People who split have this inability to see their shadow in relationship to who they are. He has surrendered to the shadow. There's no light left, no consciousness left. It's completely coming out of his unconscious fears. Now, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde piece here is what happens in every religious organization, anything. It's like you've got two people, you know. This guy lived with his family and everything was fine. Nobody knew that he had a second family in Baltimore, you know. And why was he so busy? Because he was raising two families and had two wives and nobody knew it. Or father is so generous and so good, except he's got like $200,000 hidden in a cash thing someplace. You know, this is where the split. And in most of the cases, the individual who is split does not want to know that he is split. They go in denial, okay? So I'm this, but I know I'm also this. The thing, that's why with Trump, there is no conflict. There's no conflict between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll's gone. There's only Mr. Hyde left. Okay? The only way we can grow through the shadow, personally and collectively, is that we admit the fact that I do, as a human being, I have a shadow. And that it can work against me, and I need to work towards the energy of releasing some of that shadow material in order for me to grow. Okay? I'm dealing with a directee who's highly introverted, you know, feels very comfortable doing 3 sittings of centering prayer every day, you know. But he has a hard time being here. Here in this planet, here in his body, here in his, you know. And it's like his shadow is, he's rejected ordinary life, and I said, you're too much in heaven, you need to be on earth. You're not leaving any footprints here, you know, get grounded. So, do you see what I'm saying? His shadow is actually returning to earth and being grounded with ordinary people in ordinary situations, and to allow himself conflict. And you know, this is where I go crazy with young people who don't want to live a dualistic life. You know where they are? On the couch, with their parents paying everything, okay? This non-dualism, first of all, is not a goal, because we'll never live totally non-dualistic in this planet, okay? And anyone who says they're a guru and they can live a non-dualistic life, I'm sorry, you have to decide what shoes you put on in the morning. You're living with a choice. As long as you're living with a choice, you're living with a dualism. This pair or this pair, I have to choose. So some people go to almost an extreme of withdrawing from ordinary life, and their shadow is the unlived life. They have never lived the life that they were called to live. Now, what happens is, for instance, this man who originally came to spiritual direction with me, his intention, I think, his ego intention was that I would support him and lead him even more deeply into the eternal. No. Because the bottom line was his dreams were screaming shadow material. Screaming shadow material, because the dreams were saying, you are trying to bridge to the other world when you're not finished with this world. Okay? So it's not risky for him to add a fourth prayer service during the day. It's risky for him to go out, meet people, and volunteer at the soup pantry. Get out. So the shadow is whatever I am uncomfortable with. And it could be all these good things I'm uncomfortable with. Jung said 90% of the shadow is gold. That is, it's repressed possibilities and energies that I have not lived out. That I may be called to, but I have put them aside. Okay. I think let's take a short break, stretch. Let's come back at 10 past, go to the bathroom, get something to drink. with that. We left off with I think the relationship between the three, right? Personal shadow, collective shadow, archetypal shadow. And one doorway moves into the other. And the more, see, here's the thing, is that one can delude ourselves into thinking, and this is where it's very important to have community and others who know you well, to be the truth monitors with yourself. Because one of the dangers that Jung said, one of the primary dangers is inflation. That is, my ego becomes much bigger, inflated like a balloon, okay? Now if you look at the diagram, that top circle, you have the inflated ego. But also the inflated ego is a defended ego. See, it has all this crud around it. It protects itself from outside influences or realities. the greater that ego is inflated, the more it is disconnected to the true self in the center of the diagram. Eckhart defined the Christ consciousness, or what Jung called the self, as the circle and the center in the middle. And the ego is one complex in this very important complex, the complex of consciousness. But if the ego gets out of control and starts inflating itself, okay, the more that grows, the more the connection to the voice of the authentic self is diminished. So the ego self-access there becomes weaker and weaker. And the ego gets more and more defensive, more and more fearful, much more attached, and moves into an arrogance. If you notice the pattern below, the ego is diminished in size, but is stronger in intensity. And this is one of the most paradoxical things of paradoxical consciousness. Paradoxical consciousness says, the more I diminish in my inflation, the more strong I am to choose to listen to and be in alignment with a deeper voice. So I need a very strong voice, I need a strong ego to be in relationship to the divine in order to let go of ego. A weak ego can't let go of anything. And this has been one of the main faults, I think, for generations in the church, of the distinction between humility and humiliation. That humility is a strong ego's capacity to choose beyond itself. Humiliation usually leads to defensiveness and ego protection and creates a vulnerability to be able to associate with somebody else rather than being their own voice, their own self. You see what I'm saying? The spirituality here is saying is, if you're going to be able to fight against that collective voice, what allows a Dietrich Bonhoeffer to exist? What allows individuals in history not to be seduced by the collective, or to fight that collective voice even with their whole lives? Well, they have to have a very profound strength, ego strength, right, in order to be able to listen attentively and be in alignment with God's deepest desire. And what we have not done, I think, in religious education and in spiritual development is this building up of the ego, not in false self-esteem, but in true self-knowledge. So I'm doing some formation with 6-7 people in our Bronx program to work with young adults and adolescents in spiritual direction. Because there's a tremendous amount of alienation and depression and anxiety among young people. And part of that is they're not connected. Something's not connected, okay? And the dependence of being connected on the outside, the fact is they're connected, on a peripheral level on the outside with everything and everyone, but they're not connected inside. So our mission is to create a model of spiritual direction for young people that goes beyond self-esteem. There's a book that came out on young adult spirituality in relationship to Merton, even in young adulthood, talking about the difference between the false self and the true self. Because in a sense, that top one is the false self. It's defended against its authentic center. While here, it is, the ego is not assumed in the self, it's in relationship to the self. Because that is very dangerous, that the ego becomes absorbed into the self, because then it has no ability to choose any longer. It's overwhelmed with these archetypal images. Okay. I think most of us have a very peripheral understanding of projection. You know, everybody talks about, oh, that's a projection. A projection comes from an overinflated ego. This is why I had the diagram. An overinflated ego often projects onto other people. Projection is a process where an unconscious characteristic, a fault, or even a talent of one's own is seen as belonging to another person or object. It is a normal, natural process and can be positive and negative in character. It is always accompanied by a strong emotional reaction to a person, object, or situation. Okay? So, the weaker you are, the less capable you are of owning your own story. And the more you have to project out in order to sustain the little identity that you have. So the problem is, if reality comes into that, the whole thing's going to collapse. Because this is like a balloon. It can only go so much before it involuntarily collapses and is engulfed by material that is beyond their compassion, their ability. So projection needs to be seen as a normative way of becoming conscious. A projection is not something I cannot avoid a projection. It's going to happen. Okay? Now, I have to be aware of, in its projection, what am I learning in this, both about myself and about the situation that I'm in. And like Jung said, there's no greater thing, no greater delight than to find an enemy, because then you can take all of the stuff that's hidden underneath and give it to somebody else. I'm very concerned about the collective projections onto immigrants, because this is a very dangerous issue. And people are using this dynamic connected with the shadow in order to have power. This is the smell of evil now. We're not into, well, this is a projection and blah, blah, blah. Now, this is a deliberate attempt to victimize an entire group of people in order to engage. And part of the evil is also bringing forward that darkness in other people in order to create a collective response. Okay? So, you say this thing in Ohio. Well, why is it that all of a sudden now you have hundreds of people involved in this and children are being attacked and bomb threats? Because what you've done is you've tapped into this buried stuff and you're giving them permission to project it. This is exactly what Hitler did with the Jews. He convinced the entire society that the problem in the society was Jewish. And if we could eradicate them, then we would be the perfect, individuals. Except as soon as you try and do that, you fall prey to the evil that you are afraid of. Okay? And then I think what happens societally, the worse individuals in the society take over. All the pathological liars, the people that that are really sick and take over a society and make sick decisions that impact everyone. The final solution, who was sitting at that table? Okay, if you have the wrong crowd at the conversation piece, and there's no one there that has a conscience or willing to combat, this thing, anything can happen. So we should not take projections lightly because it's psychic energy and power. And people can behave extraordinarily evil based upon this collective permission. I saw maybe 5 or 6 years ago, remember when the children were separated from their parents? Okay, now there's still hundreds of children that have never been reunited with their parents. And that was deliberately done, and they knew that this was going to be traumatic and cause trauma for the rest of their lives for the children, and they still did it. Now, this is a very, when you think of that it's a deliberate choice to implode into these children a terrific trauma that is going to be their entire life experience. And I'm going to do that to prove a point. Remember when they had a lot of teenagers on top of the trains? They were coming in on their own because things were so bad in Guatemala and El Salvador. I remember that they had been taken off and were put in a bus. And there were these gangs of white men and women surrounding the bus, saying the most horrible, horrible things to these children who were terrorized in their own country, who separated from their parents in order to choose life. It was horrific. And to me, this is evil. This is not, we cannot say, oh, it's political, it's this. No, you have to call it what it is. It is meant to hurt and to destroy. It's hatred. It's irrational hatred. So we're using a lot, like I think the transsexual projection, this irrational, over-the-top reaction to all this kind of stuff. It's all shadow material. Okay. Let's look at withdrawing projections. Now, this is much more difficult collectively than it is individually. Okay? Angeles Arian was a professor of mine at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, and she was a cross-cultural anthropologist. And what she discovered was, in her studies, that this issue of projection is truly a universal human experience. It happens in all cultures and all religious traditions. And various cultures have ways of trying to transform the projection into consciousness. How do I take in what I am losing by putting it on you? Okay, so I think we have to understand the withdrawal of projections is a spiritual practice, because it's owning your unlived story, or it's identifying the vulnerability that you have in yourself, and rather than accepting it by hating it, that's where the projection is. So it really is religious practice. I mean, if you see that if you have an individual. Now you have to understand there's two different kinds of the shadow projection. There's the dark shadow and there's the golden shadow. The golden shadow is I see in you everything lived out that I have in potential that I have not yet lived out. So I see you in an idealized way. I don't see you as a person, I see you as an ideal. Now that is also dangerous. Okay? The danger of that is that I never live out my potential because my idealization of you keeps me safe from having to risk. So I don't have to risk the behavior that would lead me into that, rather I just idealize you. And this was very true for people like Dorothy Day, and when they were talking to her about a saint, she was like, "Oh, please leave me alone. Because basically she said, that's the perfect excuse for you not to do what I am doing. If I make you a saint, I put you in a corner, put a little candle there, but I can live my life just as easy as before. So her rejection of sanctity was not rejection of sanctity, it was the rejection of the excuse not to live out the qualities and intentionality that she had. Okay, so it's much easier to do that. So golden shadows, and you know what also happens, right? With every golden shadow, you have somebody that falls off the pedestal. You know, when somebody, you know, the world is really strange. If I give a workshop and there's like, you know, large group of person and somebody comes up to me, you know, that glassy-eyed individual that says, will you be my teacher? I mean, I go, oh, sweet Jesus, get away. You know, it's like, you can tell it's like, you know, that vulnerability of like, you're the answer to my life. No, 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 no. Introject that, and your life is inside. You need to find that. See, it's an excuse for not doing the work. And that's why it is also just as evil as if it was a dark shadow, because it stops you from living your potential. I have an Hispanic woman that is very bright and done all this kind of stuff, but you know, she idealizes certain people beyond their ability because she always gets stuck finishing her own work to bring it to conclusion. She's afraid of her own success because as an Hispanic woman, she's afraid of what that might mean. What will that mean in terms of family or of this or that, you know? So she sabotages herself and idealizes another. And of course, it's the opposite with projection, right? She'll see that white person as being successful, and then she'll demean herself by not accomplishing it in order to sustain her role and where it's safe. You know? So I worked many years in inner city schools teaching Hispanic and black children, and that was one of the greatest fears, was success. Because that would mean, you know, my persona would have to radically change. You know, I could lose my friends, my family might tease me. You know, if I get a 4-year scholarship somewhere, you know, that's going to take me away from them. You know, it's very ambivalent. So, but that's all shadow work. It's the collective and the individual working through that shadow. She says, you know, there's a 5-point process here. She writes, the positive aspect of every projection is that it is a disowned part of ourselves on its way home. Before we can fully reclaim disowned parts of ourselves, it is necessary to go through the 5 stages of projection. Now, I'm raising the question, how would our society change if we stopped projecting and turned it back inside and say, what's going on in us that caused this irrational response? What's going on in me? What is the fear, the unknown? You know, and it's so racially based. Of course it has to be Haitians, the blackest. You know, it's so racially based and based on ignorance. So we look around and find the perfect person to hold our projection. Now, we're not doing this consciously. This is an unconscious behavior. So I'm not looking for it. It just arrives. But the way and shape that it's formed, it has the perfect way for me to see the other as other. Okay? And you have to ask yourself, what kind of person usually becomes the person that holds your projection? When are you disturbed by someone? When does somebody kind of shift your energy? Or you're in a large group, okay, you're in this big meeting, and you say, oh, she is like that, I can tell. And she will be in your small group, you watch. Or God will put her, you're eating and there's an empty seat, and God, who's going to show up? There's a synchronicity that always happens, like an energetic pull, right? Because this is the important thing. What's disowned in me, or I have refused to admit is in me, that she or he is the perfect image. And you only know that it's a projection because it's irrational, spontaneous, and deep. That's a projection. It's not a projection just like, well, I would rather talk to somebody else. No, it's only a projection when it's intense, okay, and it's spontaneous and has depth to it. Like this whole thing with the Haitians, that was almost immediately spontaneous. People erupted with it as soon as the projection started. And it's a part of a whole collective shadow thing. I can't believe it, is how it can be so manipulated, right? We dote on our pets more than we pay attention to hungry children. I mean, the amount of money that's being spent on pets, I love my sister dearly, but she spent hundreds of dollars on this little 3-pound little dog, okay, to keep him alive for another year. And you say to yourself, okay, we do this with our pets. Now, isn't it a perfect projection that these are so horrible? They actually eat the pets that we spend all this time and love and energy. It is the most outrageous projection, most outrageous collective projection, and it works because of our attachments. We're more attached to our pets than to starving people. Of course we are. That's the point that they're saying. We would step over these people in order to bring our pet to the vet. That's what they're saying. So the perfect projection holds, okay? The second is, after a while, it begins to slip, okay? The irrational can only last so long. You know what happens? You have this thing that it comes like this, right? Like an explosion, and gradually it begins to wear down again because it loses its energy. So the projection begins to slip. We see the individual may be something other than what I have projected. This is like somebody has this projection of a golden shadow, and all of a sudden this golden shadow doesn't pay particular attention to whoever the person is, or answers a question in a way that they don't like, and all of a sudden there's this little. See, what happens with conflict is conflict helps you to recognize that the projection is wrong. I start noticing that they're not that way. They're not either so idealized or that bad. Okay? The projection begins to slip. The projection falls off at some point. Is there an aha? Now, I thought, when Trump was trying to reinforce this projection at the debate, I loved Harris's response, because she just stood there and laughed. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because with a projection, you can't take it seriously, because it's totally irrational. If you're rational, you'll say, oh, this is ridiculous. You laugh. But you notice his intensity increased to reassert the projection. He had to convince the people out there that this is all true, even though they knew it was a lie. Okay, and I think she reacted the best way that you can. It's beyond words. You can't say anything about it. You're not going to debate, which cat was eaten or what dog was. I mean, you demean yourself into the darkness of the projection. All you can do is laugh and say, this is ridiculous. Recognition, okay? Recognition is when I realize that I got trapped by this instinctive need to withdraw from my responsibility. The aha is when I see, oh, I fell into a projection. Like when we fall in love, that's the same thing. We fall in love with a projection. And if you're really going to love somebody, you're going to have to let go of the projection and see the reality of the person. Well, this is falling in hatred, or this is falling in whatever. It's a spontaneous, irrational response. Now the recognition is, I got trapped. Okay? Now, people see our projections better than we see our own, because projections are unconscious dynamics. You can observe somebody else's unconscious dynamics. Like, if somebody is really overreacting on something, somebody who knows you say, what's going on? Why are you so crazy about this? What's it tapping into? Okay, and it could be some original wound in oneself, could be identification with the victim, then this is where unconscious meets unconscious. Okay? Now, the recognition is the beginning not only of healing, but potentially integrating that shadow material into your life. So if you now know, and it's potentially revealed, you have greater acuity to be able to say, I can do something with this energy. Okay? Which means growth. I can grow through the experience. And lastly, she said that we need compassion both on ourselves and the ones to whom we have projected on, that somehow this is a dynamic meant for the growth of everyone. And to integrate that projection into one's life. The more you integrate the projection, the less the necessity for you to be trapped in a projection. Okay? I mean, when you're a teenager and you fall in love, I mean, that's as spontaneous as breathing, I mean, I taught high school for 20-some years. I mean, the hallway was an entirely euphoric projection of something, and it would be either, antagonism, or love at first sight, or, irrational behavior. But to realize that we are always vulnerable at any age, but if we learn compassionately our response to our history of projection, it will be less dramatic. So you can say, oh, I can feel the hook, but I don't have to go there, because I've been there like several thousand times, and it never really worked. So why am I spending this energy on it? You know what I mean? This is the growth and the wisdom of aging, that and that's why it's so hard with kids. It's all projection, but they really believe everything they project. So you have a 15-year-old, which I had one time, in such depression because he broke up with his girlfriend, he wanted to kill himself. And here was this beautiful young man, 15 years old, ready to hang himself over this emotion and belief that it's over. And I'm saying to myself, it's not even begun yet, but it's so intense. That's why the intensity we have to learn from those intense moments, Now let's look at the Jung and the shadow on page 6. 10. I'm sorry, Jung and the shadow. let's look at some of his insights. It has been believed hitherto that the human shadow was the source of all evil. It can now be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious person, that is his shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instinct, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, and creative impulses. Now, I want to focus on creative impulses. I'm dealing with several people who are highly creative, but are also in highly demanding jobs. And I'm finding that in 3 cases that I've dealt with, when they don't pay attention to their creative impulse and the expression of that creative impulse, they get sick. And creativity, is a demand from the unconscious. There was this one, actually I got a text yesterday from a woman who has a highly competitive, job, and she's instinctively an artist. And she set up a little art studio in her apartment. And of course, given life, she never has time. But what happens is, and she's now learning just observation, if I don't spend time allowing the creative impulse to come forward, then I become less connected and less efficient and less affectively connected in my work. And she's seeing that it's not the opposite. It's really a union of creativities, different creativities. She was putting it in this extreme duality. It's either work or creativity. And I think what's happening is her conversion is, I need to live a creative life wherever I am. And she's an incredible artist. I mean, she sends me things, and it's like, it's really beautiful. But I think it's one of those things where her soul demands creativity. And if it doesn't happen, she gets sick, either depressed or normal instincts, like anger or frustration, or appropriate reactions, realistic insights. If we keep all of those things in the unconscious, we never develop. What we do is we become, how would I say, a puppet of what other people want us to be. They pull all the strings. And then a whole parts of our life is left unlived. So I think what Jung is saying is, the shadow is not all evil. It's mostly unlived. And it becomes dark and viewed as evil because it's been unlived. The prospect of coming to terms with the other in us is well worthwhile, because in this way we get to know the aspects of our nature which we would not allow anyone else to show us and which we would never have admitted. If we go down to, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Now, this is very different than trying to be perfect. Sue Monk Kidd talked about the unholy trinity: perfection, pleasing, and performance. She called that the unholy trinity: perfection, pleasing, and performance. The moral issue here is, can I create a spiritual discipline in which, rather than suppressing my dark side, I allow it to emerge for me to acknowledge it and know it? Now, for a lot of people who live perfection, pleasing, and performance, their first dreams in spiritual direction are always about bathrooms backing up. always about bathrooms backing up, all over the rug. And they try and clean it, and they get covered with it, and they pollute everything they're touching. And part of that is there's no place to let go of how you're really feeling. Or shit happens. Now, I have this little book that I use for emergencies like this. And it's a child's book about teaching children how to be potty trained, okay? And the whole book is about poop. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's the cutest book. Right. Everybody poops. I love this. So, because there are people who really believe that they shouldn't poop. You know, that they're like angels, you know. And all you need to do is have a group of sophomore boys and farting. And you know the human condition is ripe, okay? We're just creatures, okay? But what happens with the shadow is it represents our creatureliness. And if you don't want to accept the fact that you're a creature, that's the problem. And I think a lot of the problems with aging is people refuse to admit that they're a creature. You know? Everybody gets old. It's like everybody poops. Everything gets old. You get an old elephant, you get an old, everybody gets old. And creaky and tired and all that kind of stuff. But what I do with people like that is we look at the book and it's like, and I love this one page. Sometimes there are big poops and there's an elephant, and on the other page there's a little ant or something. And if you eat, you poop, and it's educative. But for somebody who thinks they have to be perfect and always pleasing and always performing, they can't allow themselves to be human. And what we do in this society is we project our humanity, our instinctual life, our dark side of simply being a creature, we project that onto other people. We're not like that. Okay? We're not like that. Oh, yes, you are. Okay? And that's the giant projection that's going on. They're not human, meaning instinctual creatures like everybody else. So it is a moral problem. It's a deeply moral problem. But unfortunately, what you get from priests and pastors is how to be perfect, pleasing, and performing. That's the unholy trinity. This last one probably should be in the... When Jung came to the United States, he came several times. And one time he went in the South, okay? And he said, what you see is the cordiality and the politeness hides a very dark shadow of how they treat their interiority and how they treat others. That it's a facade. And I have to say, you don't get cordiality a lot in the Bronx. But if you go south, I go to Charleston, you stop at a store, all of a sudden I'm sir. I'm never sir any place in the Bronx. Can I help you, sir? And it's so nice. It's so polite. It feels so civilized, right? But you can probably smell that there's something underneath this that's not always the same. They don't treat everybody that way. I have frequently observed in the analysis of Americans that the inferior side of the personality, that is the instinctual person, is represented by a Negro or an Indian, whereas in the dream of the European, it would be represented by a somewhat shady individual of his own kind. These representatives of the other races stand for the inferior personality components of the person. In other words, what's inferior in the dreamer is represented by the Native American or the black in this country. In Europe, And it's the same thing that what happened to Europe. Who did Hitler get rid of? Jews, gypsies, all who were inferior, gays that were inferior in their view. And their dreams would have brought that up. In us, it's just the same thing. We have collectively taken these racial dimensions to represent our instinctive human, what would be viewed as inferior self. And we are seeing this on a huge, huge, multi-million expressive level every day. This is going on every day. So if we look at the structure of the psyche, okay, this is from Dwight Judy, who was a professor of mine, and he was also a Methodist minister, so he had a faith dimension. If you see, God is the divine ground of being in both ends. So if the middle there represents the ego's relationship to the outer world, and from the middle down is the relationship to our inner world. So there's a balance between both outer and inner. And the ego is not the center, as it says here. If we take it, to make sense of this graph, you'd have to see it as a sheet that you pull up, okay? And the ego's the surface, and then everything down goes further down. Okay, so this is not out, but down, actually. So, and if you notice the body-mind integration, there's the shadow erupts in both of these experiences as we integrate ourselves, the personal shadow and the collective shadow. We are in a period worldwide of a huge collective shadow, okay, way down in that archetypal pattern. I don't think it's been this strong collectively since the 1930s, okay? I want to, do you need a 5-minute stretch? Or no, are you okay? Because I want to now we're going to get into evil. Okay, archetypal evil. Myself and a colleague have been giving a year-long course on evil that we've done on the internet for the last 4 years. And we're not doing it this year, but we have decided that we're constructing a book. We're going to write a book on it in relationship to our experience as spiritual directors, how we have encountered the reality of evil in people's lives. James Hollis, who is a famous Jungian from Dallas, and this is a very important quote for us today. Too much morality strengthens evil in the inner world. Now, we never think about too much morality, but too much identification with external morality. Okay, I'm the good person. You know, I always tithe, I always do this, okay? The more too much of that in the outer world strengthens the evil in the inner world. Too little morality, okay, disassociates between good and evil. In other words, if you have no moral compass, if you have no moral ability to make decisions, then you're just based upon feelings. You don't know the difference between good and evil. And, you know, sometimes we see people who really can't distinguish behaviors that we would normally say, this is good and this is evil. There's a disassociation. So too little morality. So over here you have the rigidity of a moral base. These are the super good people, okay? And over here you have people who have never been trained in anything, okay? It's just instinctive, whatever feels good. So we live in a world of these dualities, right? The shabby component of contemporary moral vigilantes embodies the former imbalance. Now, let's look at that. In other words, the contemporary moral vigilantes are the people who are aligned with religion, politics, and economics. It's the American religious system, and that is totally ecumenical. That has nothing to do with denominations. There's no distinction. That could be in a Catholic church, it could be in a Methodist church, it could be a Pentecostal church. This is the morally good people who allow the darkness within to exist, and the more the darkness is within, the more likely there's projections. The currency of unconscious acting out in personal and public life embodies the other. So these good people talk about Hollywood. You know those people in Hollywood, they have no morality, they have no thing, they're all into transsexuals and blah, blah. All the darkness gets onto the other side, and then vice versa. Okay? Ann Ulinoff, who has recently retired from teaching at Union in New York, she is both a Jungian analyst and a theologian. So she is the best person to do this Christian-Jungian dialogue. Okay, we'll come back to this quote from Jung. She says, evil is a mystery, not a problem to be solved or eradicated. Because as soon as you eradicate evil, you become evil. This is the danger. Illness blurs into evil. We can feel it in the relational field between us, that the person not only suffers being held fast by something that determines their life, and now more and more threatens to annihilate their subjective agency, their inmost self, and through them the selves of others. There is a fine line between the events that happen sometimes in this world, between mental illness and evil, and you can't really tell the difference. One blurs sometimes into one another. Now listen to this, what she says, the effects of evil in its power to degrade truth, so it is unrecognizable, to refuse to acknowledge accountability. January 6th was beautiful. It was a love fest. There was nothing that happened there. To acknowledge accountability. To extinguish agency. To wipe things away. I never did that. To evade, avoid, denying, forgetting, disavowing, concealing, going numb, retreating, withholding, withdrawing, vitiating. These are the effects of evil. Do they sound familiar? Are they present in our collective reality? Especially to degrade truth. How about that slaves were taught skills? They were given skills, and they were happy. This is what was trying to be reversed. Evil is an indelible stain or scar that cannot be erased. When I have dealt with people who were scarred by early trauma, which was evil, okay, there is a scarring. That doesn't mean that they are evil. This is Harry Potter. This is the archetype of Harry Potter. He indirectly encountered evil at a primitive time of his life. And therefore, he was marked to deal with evil for the rest of his life. I don't know how many directees that I've had who have had traumatic beginnings in life that had an indelible scar put into their psyche. It could have been the death of a parent. I'm dealing with a man who was sexually abused by his father probably from the age of 5 to 12, okay, would shower with him and had no boundaries whatsoever. These are indelible marks. The danger is that they identify themselves as evil because they've been touched by evil. And there's a big difference between being touched by evil and becoming evil. And I think what's important for us is to differentiate where there is evil, not to participate, and even not to over-exaggerate, because if you over-exaggerate evil, it becomes more evil. You know, this is where, you know, there are two dangers. One is you don't pay attention to evil at all, or the second is you give it too much premise and give it too much power as if it is the most powerful force, which it is not the most powerful force. But if you become obsessed with evil, then you give it more power than it is worth. Once set loose, such logic as evil replicates relentlessly until all of us are addicted to its rhythms. And there's an addictive pattern to this evil dynamic. And it's generational. You inherited hatred from an earlier source, and that hatred got into an earlier source, and it's generational. So that my identity is intertwined with the evil itself. I am the person who hates this, because it is generationally based. Personal shadow material can be traced to family prohibitions and cultural mores about what is acceptable and what is rejected.
So,
Yes.
so our, the right word is projection
Yeah.
of evil to devil,
Yeah.
the devil or devils.
Right.
Is that playing into this whole?
When we project evil as an entity outside of our experience and outside of ourselves, we separate ourselves from the reality of my obligation to deal with evil. In other words, my capacity for evil is also an interior reality. There is nothing I cannot do. If it is human, there is nothing I cannot do. That is a very scary thought, but very real. Okay? But there is a presence of force that is malignant and desires you to move towards despair. To me, the sign of evil is, the logic of evil is despair, the opposite of hope. It wants you to believe that you are nothing, you deserve nothing, your absence of ever being loved. The logic of evil is despair. Okay? Now, she says some very important things here. Clinical work uncovers the dreadful causality between personal shadow and social injustice. Thus blooms the ugliness of prejudice, discrimination, persecution, oppression, even genocide. It all comes from the dreadful connection between my personal shadow and its surrender to another and another and another, so that my identity gets lost, my conscience is numbed, and now I uncover that I move into this role of injustice and hatred. Greater consciousness takes us deeper into the mystery of evil, which moves us into the decision to participate in this or not. I'm trying to think of the film. I think of these films and I can't think of the title. This was about The Reader. Did you ever see The Reader? She was a woman that was involved in Nazism and so forth. And she had this relationship with a young boy when he was young, and she was participating in. Remember, she was brought into trial, and they had put all these people in a barn and set it on fire, and she was participating in this. Her relationship to evil, okay, was basically remaining totally unconscious. Not having, because you notice there was no real conflict until the end. She really believed that she loved him and he loved her, but she lived in a fantasy world in which she was deliberately choosing to become unconscious. And when consciousness came and she began to see her participation in it, it was overwhelming her system, right? She couldn't bear what she had done. So wrestling with the shadow is a form of social action, personally and collectively. What's really important in this is the quote, "In Christian thought, Christ, though innocent, suffers as if guilty and ends the logic of evil by taking our suffering into his body and is not destroyed by it or by the death it inflicts. The abyss of love is revealed as stronger than the abyss of death." So the darkness and mystery of love is more powerful than the abyss of death and destruction. The power of love is stronger than the power of hate. Now, she's saying this both as a clinician and also as a theologian, that we have to believe that there is a dimension within us of the abyss of love that is greater than our capacity for hatred. But it depends on to whom do I surrender. Do I surrender to the abyss of love, or do I surrender to the abyss of hatred? And you know, we all have to make that decision. Sometimes I shock myself how much I can hate. It's really shocking what I would like to do to a person. And that reminds me of this reality, that in my human reality, I can move to the abyss of love, or I can be drawn into the very abyss of hatred that I hate. And that potential is there. Okay, the very last thing, we have 15 minutes, right? 12:30?
Yes.
Okay. If you turn to the last couple of pages, resistance and hope to the deepest love and goodness of being. This is about the reality of, and our definition of goodness. I told, we have camps during the summer at our property. It's 10 weeks, I think, of different camps for kids that are, or disabled, or, you know, kids with cancer, you know, they all have different needs. And I find the staff have more profound religious experience than the campers, because, you know, they're initiated into vulnerability and care, and, you know, it's a very powerful place for young adults to grapple with, you know, the mysteries of life. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is the definition of good. You know, there's this thing at camp, like, God is good, and everybody answers, and God is always good. Now, that's cute. However, what do we mean by good? You know, God is always good, so my mother dies, then God's not good anymore. And we have to redo this. This is not working, because it's not mysterious enough to our reality of God. God is good, and God is always good. And if you want to be good, you have to be better. You're not dealing with the reality of here. Because there are levels of goodness. Just as there are levels of evil, there's levels of goodness. And the goodness of, like I said, the goodness of going to church and doing the right thing and tithing, that can last only so long. Because authentic goodness has to go through a period of testing. And the testing is always the three bottom chakras, the three basic human things. The instinct for survival, the instinct for procreation, and the instinct for power. These are fundamental creature instincts. They never go away. You can be 90 years old and you're still fighting for control. You're still fighting for, what your needs need to be. It doesn't go away. Those instincts just are universal. But unless goodness is capacity to be tested in these arenas, okay, these human arenas, you never get to deeper goodness. Because what happens is the highest good, the highest light, has to go through the darkest darkness. Superficial goodness is broken very easily. Because I find good people are filled with resentment. That other people are getting away with things, things are unjust. We clean our lawn and they don't. And it's filled with all kinds of judgments and stuff. That superficial goodness is not true goodness. It's not the goodness of God. That's the goodness of persona and culture, okay? And what you had in Germany, right? You had a lot of good people who went to church and did all those things, just like here. But they got that deeper goodness, that deeper reality beneath that dark shadow was not collectively engaged. There were individual lights that came through. But we can't afford just individuals. We need to bring the collective with us to face our vulnerability and humanity so that we can get in touch with a deeper goodness. Jung says the unconscious is not just evil by nature, it's also the source of the highest good. Not only the dark, but also the light. Not only bestial, semi-human, and demonic, but superhuman, spiritual, in the classical sense of the word, divine. But you don't go through that, you don't reach that until you go through the darknesses of facing your own reality as a creature. The intensities which are both containable and uncontainable is described as beauty, intimacy, becoming, love, and encounters with the divine. These are reflections as a spiritual director, how I have encountered this deeper goodness and its challenge to us. Those who suffered significant trauma and live restrictive lives, the good is hard to receive. Ever notice a good person that cannot receive? Their goodness is limited because they cannot receive the full experience of goodness. It's one-sided. I had a cousin that it was actually funny in the family. We'd invite her for dinner. She'd bring a whole dinner. She had an alternative dinner. We say, bring dessert. Not for 100. There's 8 of us. It's like she always had to make up because she could not receive. If you gave her something, you would get a thank you card and another gift. You couldn't beat her in her giving. She had to be in charge of her giving. But she couldn't receive goodness. There was a blockage there to receiving love. Okay? Do you see what I'm saying? And sometimes people who have had trauma in their lives don't know how to receive, or has to outdo whatever they have received by giving it even more. The experience of the good has a huge range from mild to life intensities. Now, what we're talking about here is breakthroughs. The profound good creates great intensity and moves to the edges of the unknowable. This is religious experience. Okay? They create vulnerability by overcoming the neurotically defined barriers of the past. It's almost as if religious experience wants to break through your narcissistic self-protection and allow the goodness to it's like almost like the image that I have is like a needle breaking in there and letting the fluid into what has been dry. The unknown is frightening to the ego, even the greatest graces. The good emerges in relationships where both are moving towards the higher good. One of the greatest gifts that humans can bring is the capacity to have human interpersonal relationships that bring the good out of us. You know, even as teenagers, right? I mean, there's a kid that could be selfish and narcissistic. Once he falls in love, all of a sudden he wants to give. For the first time in his life, he's thinking about what can I give? It's a revolution. Okay, so love usually creates a revolution of, oh my God, what can I give back? The third is creating a relationship has to do with the power of transpersonal energy between people. This is incarnational love. What we call the terror of the good. Rebirth. For some, the possibilities of psychic rebirth creates instability and attachments to the old, to the terror of the good. It's paradoxical that we develop defenses from the truly good so that we can remain in control. Hope is jumping into the unfamiliar with the desire for a new outcome. The ego is conservative in that a primary talk is to protect and preserve conscious life as we have known it. Hope is the divine energy of trust. Being, working at a retreat house, I find it amazing. People spend hundreds of dollars, come to a retreat house, set themselves up with a retreat director, goes through all the prayers and the stuff, and are shocked if they have a religious experience. You paid to come here to get a religious experience. What's going on? Because the shock is God can initiate. I don't have to work for anything. It's already there. It's a gift. Okay? So it's like, it's so funny that people are very funny about this. You know, they anticipate, and when it arrives, they don't know what to do with it. How could this happen? Well, you've been asking for it. That's the grace you've been praying for. Okay? The truly good taps into our, deepest energy. Jung said, only the numinous truly heals. Only the encounter with the holy really heals. Unbind us from fear. Okay, there's a beautiful quote here that I'd like to kind of challenge us with. A challenge posed by the truly good is that it is much more than good. I bring the elemental forces which arise outside the ego, which penetrate, overwhelm me, and subject the conscious self to containable feeling states. The truly good asks us to hold on, to become a witness to something from the depths. Quiet suffering is required. To suffer that moment is to encounter what it is to be explicitly intimate, to expand the main accessibility to one's life, to be deeply loved, to encounter the divine. It is the encounter the power of the beautiful, including the beauty and anguish of what it means to be human. It is to endure the terror of the good. That is our capacity and our fate, if we are willing to embrace it. And you don't have this poem with you, but I'd like to end with this poem. It is called "We Are Not Powerless." When evil falls like a hailstorm, and cruelty pounds living beings into the earth, when the cloud of ash descends with its broad wings and thoughtless moments, we seem so small and feel so helpless, but we are not. We are remnants of the light of creation, little heavens in whom the mighty grace of God throbs like nuclear power. We are frail and vaulted as we are vessels of the Spirit of life, stewards of the peace of God. In our hope burns a greater power. Our good will joins the energy field that moves mountains. We cannot gauge the quantum of hope that shimmers unseeable in our hope. We trust, and our hope defeats the powers that would have us despair. Radiant with love, even before the dawn, the victory is ours. Amen. Thank you. We did a lot.